Welcome to the Chronicles of the Roman Emperor channel. Today, we'll explore the topic of the most brutal torture devices in history. We believe this video will have two parts. Don't forget to support us with a like and subscription. Enjoy watching. The Spanish boot, or iron boot, was one of the cruelest torture tools used in Europe, especially during the Inquisition. The basic design of this device consisted of two metal plates that clamped the victim's leg. The plates were fastened with screws, and the executioner gradually tightened them, crushing bones and soft tissues, causing unbearable pain. Initially, the legs were squeezed slowly to prolong the victim's suffering. This allowed control over the intensity of the pain, increasing it with each turn of the screw. A particularly cruel version of the Spanish boot had spikes on the inside of the plates. When they began to tighten, the spikes penetrated deeply, damaging muscles and tissues, and sometimes even piercing bones, causing injuries that were impossible to heal. Even if the victim survived, they were left crippled for life. The Spanish boot was used as a method of punishment, but it was often part of interrogations. Torture could last for hours. The executioner slowly turned the screws, intensifying the agony each time. It is believed that this method was used not only to extract confessions, but also to intimidate others. Those who witnessed these torments were meant to reconsider resisting authority or breaking laws. This instrument became one of the symbols of medieval cruelty, showing the extent to which the system could go to maintain obedience and fear among the population. The Spanish boot has always remained in history as a reminder of dark times when physical pain was the main tool of justice and control. The Iron Maiden is one of the most horrifying symbols of medieval cruelty. This device looked like a sarcophagus or a large cabinet that could stand upright, shaped like a human body. It was designed to create the impression of a terrifying monument of death and suffering, made of iron. It was hollow inside, and metal spikes were placed within its walls. When the doors were closed, these spikes penetrated the victim's body, causing numerous wounds. But the feature of this method was that the spikes often did not touch vital organs, so the victim would not die immediately. The Iron Maiden was crafted with particular attention to detail. Externally, it could have a sinister face, whose expression seemed to point to it. Different versions had their own features. Some had only a few spikes placed at key points, such as the chest, abdomen, eyes, or thighs, while other versions included a larger number of spikes aimed at various parts of the body to slowly but surely inflict deep wounds. However, the placement of the spikes was calculated to keep the victim alive as long as possible. Medieval sources mention that the Iron Maiden was often used to punish heretics, witches, blasphemers, and traitors. It is believed that this torture not only punished, but also had a psychological impact. The victim realized they were in an iron embrace from which escape was impossible, and they were under the threat of death. But death did not come immediately. In some cases, the sarcophagus doors were opened, allowing the victim a brief respite. Despite the Iron Maiden's grim reputation, historians still debate whether this instrument was used as often as mentioned in texts. There are suggestions that some mentions might have been exaggerated or even fabricated by later eras to emphasize the cruelty and darkness of the Middle Ages. However, the Iron Maiden remains a symbol of unspeakable horror, reminding us of how torture methods were used to maintain fear and obedience, and to demonstrate power through suffering and pain. The Iron Maiden became such a powerful symbol of cruelty that legends and stories were made about it. Even in the modern world, it continues to hold its place as one of the most terrifying torture machines in history. The wheel of death, or breaking wheel, was one of the most horrifying methods of punishment in medieval Europe. This torture device was used for executing criminals, especially those accused of murder and rebellion, treason, and other serious crimes. It was meant not only to cause death, but to do so in a brutal and a demonstrative way that would serve as a lesson to others. Execution on the Wheel of Death became a spectacle that often drew crowds. Publicity was part of this horrific process to demonstrate the consequences of breaking the law and to suppress potential uprisings among the population. The construction and principle of the Wheel of Death were as follows. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel or bench that rotated. Often, the person was laid on the wheel in a stretched position with limbs tied to keep the body immobile. The executioner used a special hammer or iron rod to strike the victim's limbs, gradually breaking the bones of the arms and legs. The goal was to inflict as much pain as possible without killing the victim immediately. Bone fractures caused sharp pain, and often the bones pierced the skin, exposing the damaged limbs. After this, the victim was left on the wheel, which was raised so that all present could see their agony. However, the suffering did not end there. After the victim's bones were broken, they could be left on the wheel, raised above the ground, where the person could suffer in agony for hours or even days before dying from blood loss, dehydration, or shock. History mentions cases where the body was tied to the wheel and left there until it completely decomposed, as a constant reminder of the punishment awaiting those who dared to break the law. Often, the wheel was placed in a prominent location, such as on a hill or by a road, so passers-by could see what happened to the victim. This reinforced fear of the law and served as a psychological weapon to keep people in submission. And although such a method of execution destroyed the body and caused unspeakable suffering, it also had a religious context. It was believed that through suffering, the criminal's soul was cleansed. The Wheel of Death is a symbol of how medieval society perceived punishment, not only as an act of justice, but also as a public spectacle meant to deter others. Today, the Wheel of Death reminds us of a dark era in human history when torture and public executions were considered a necessary part of justice and social control. The breast ripper or iron claws was one of the most brutal torture devices used in medieval Europe, particularly against women accused of crimes such as adultery, blasphemy, witchcraft, and heresy. This device was designed to inflict terrible and incurable injuries. The construction of the breast ripper was relatively simple but horribly effective. It consisted of 2 or more metal claws, resembling pincers. The claws or spikes were shaped so that when they gripped the victim's breasts and were tightly squeezed, they literally tore the soft tissues, leaving horrific wounds accompanied by significant bleeding. In some versions of this device, the claws had serrated edges that penetrated deeper into the tissues, increasing the intensity of the pain. The process of application was extremely painful and almost always resulted in serious injuries that were practically impossible to heal with the medical knowledge of the time. Even if a woman survived such torture, she was left mutilated and helpless, and the damage was so significant that it could lead to blood poisoning, sepsis, or gradual death from complications. In some cases, the device was heated to intensify the suffering and make the injury irreversible. This device was used as a tool of intimidation and punishment, but also had deep symbolic meaning. Its use highlighted the low social status and vulnerability of women in medieval society. It also reflected the attitudes of the time towards women, who were considered less valuable, especially if accused of witchcraft or moral sins. Such tortures were conducted publicly to create an atmosphere of fear and submission, leaving other women with a grim reminder of the consequences of disobedience or accusations of crimes against morality and religion. Today, the breast ripper is considered one of the most horrific instruments of the medieval era, a symbol of the inhumanity and ruthlessness of the past. It reminds us of the dark pages of history when physical pain was used as a means of coercion and punishment, reinforcing a system of social and religious control that kept society in submission through fear and cruelty. The witch's cage, also known as the water trial cage, was one of the many torture devices aimed at punishing women accused of witchcraft in medieval Europe. Its purpose was not only to punish, but also to conduct trials that could determine the fate of the accused. Structurally, it was a large iron cage, often suspended over water or on a high platform, allowing the victim to be lowered or kept in an uncomfortable, suspended position. The procedure was simple but terrifying. The woman was placed in the cage and lowered into the water, sometimes for extended periods. The essence was that if the woman accused of witchcraft did not drown, it was taken as proof of her guilt, as water, being a pure substance, repels witches. If she drowned, it was considered an exoneration, although it could no longer save her life. In some cases, the cage was suspended at a great height, and the victim remained there exposed to the elements without food or water, which became another means of torment and public humiliation. This method, along with other water trials, reflects the cruel superstitions and fears of medieval society, where any behavior deviating from social norms could be a reason for accusations of black magic. The witch's cage and water trials also served to intimidate the population and suppress disobedience among women. And although today these methods are considered overtly cruel and inhumane, they show how deeply fear and superstition could shape approaches to justice in society. The rat torture, or rat torture, was a brutal method known since ancient Rome and used later throughout the centuries for torture and intimidation. The main principle of this torture method was the use of live rats, known for their strong survival instinct and ability to gnaw through obstacles to escape. During the torture, the victim was tied to a bed or chair with a cage of rats placed on their bare stomach or chest. The cage was then heated using flames or other heat sources. The rats, feeling the temperature rise and seeking to escape the heat, began to look for a way to escape, gnawing through the victim's flesh. This caused unspeakable pain and often led to infections and bleeding, which could lead to death even after the torture ended. Additionally, due to fear and agony, the victim often lost self-control, revealing what the torturers demanded. Rat torture became a tool for medieval inquisitors and other tyrants who used it to extract confessions or intimidate opponents. It served not only as a means of punishment, but also as a tool of psychological terror, as the prospect of a painful death by rats always instilled great fear. This method, despite its cruelty, is one of the many examples of torture used throughout history for coercion, punishment, or control over the human mind and body.